So welcome everyone to this Tonisity webinar. Before introducing our speaker, I would like to quickly introduce Tonisity. So Tonisity International is a company based in Dublin in Ireland. We were founded in 2015 and we are focusing on the development of innovative nutritional products which are not only beneficial for animal health, but more important, which guarantee a real internal investment for the producers, for our customers. And we have been focusing mainly on the piglet gut health. And since 5 years, we have conducted more than 140 different trials in 31 countries. We have been doing about 1/3 as research trial and 2/3 as producer evaluation trials, and those trials have involved, I would say today, close to 200,000 pigs. So now I would like to introduce our speaker, Dr. John Patience. He was born and raised on a swine farm in Canada, in southern Ontario. He got his Bachelor of Science and Master of Science from the University of Guelph, and then he got his PhD at Cornell University. He has been working in extension, in feed industry, and also in applied research. For example, 21 years at Prairie Swine Center, where he was their president and CEO. And since 2008, he is in Iowa State University as professor of applied swine nutrition. John's research topics include, of course, water. This is what he will discuss today, but he's also involved in research on amino acid, energy requirements, fiber and gut health, and general win to finish management. He has been he's fellow of American Society of Animal Science, fellow of Canadian Society of Animal Science. He has been nominated Master of the Pork Industry, National Hog Farmer Magazine, and also honorary Master Pork Producer, Iowa Pork Producers Association. So it's a great pleasure for us to welcome today John Patience, who will discuss the different aspects related to water in the pig and especially the piglet. Thank you, John. Go ahead.
Well, thank you so much, Mathieu, and to Tonisity for inviting me to be a part of the webinar today. I would like to say good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to our listeners. It's always a pleasure for me, a true pleasure for me, to be able to talk about one of my favorite topics, which is, of course, is water. Now, in the course of my presentation today, I will cover 4 different aspects of water. I'm going to start out by discussing why is water so important? What is water important for? I'm going to talk about how much water do pigs really need, and do pigs typically get enough water? Then I'm going to move on and discuss a little bit on the best way to deliver water to the pig and talk about some of the issues there. And then my last topic will be to discuss water quality. How do we measure water quality, and what does water quality mean to a pig? What does it do to a pig? So my first topic then is the importance of water. And if you look at these pictures that are typical in any hog barn, you can see that it's impossible to really stand in any location in a barn and not see some evidence of the importance of water, because water pipes, water drinkers or nipple drinkers, water treatment facilities, pressure valves, etc., are everywhere. And so evidently water must be important, because we see it throughout the barn. But then why is it that water seems to get so little attention? You know, why do we take water for granted? Well, actually, I think the answer to that question is fairly straightforward. Water is abundant. It's free, or almost free, at least in our part of the world, and it's convenient. So we ignore water because it's easy to ignore it. When something is abundant, free, convenient to deliver to the pig, and when you think of all the other things that a person working in the barn or an owner has to attend to in a typical day in the hog barn with their normal chores, plus things that come up, health problems, repairs, etc., it's easy to take water for granted and to overlook it. When you think about it, there's another thing that we take for granted, and that is it's just as important as water is to us, and that's air. Because air is also abundant, it's free, and it's convenient. So we don't really think very much, at least most of us don't think very much about the air that we breathe, and yet it really can be described in the same terms as water. Now, maybe we should look at why should we not take water for granted? Well, number one, water is essential in the pig's diet. And I think everybody knows that a pig can't live very long without water, and especially if the pig is exposed to hot weather, the absence of water can be fatal fairly quickly. Another reason why we shouldn't take water for granted is we don't understand it nearly well enough. We've been doing research, people have been doing research on water for decades and decades, and yet there's still much that we don't understand. As I'm going to show a little bit later in my presentation, almost every function of the body involves water one way or another. So that's another reason to not take it for granted. And finally, and depending again on the part of the world that you live in, water is becoming in increasingly short supply. And the water that we need for agriculture, we are increasingly in competition with other people that want to use water. So let's take a look at the list of functions of water. Water plays an extremely important role in maintaining constant body temperature, which of course is very, very important. If the temperature of the body changes too much, that can have an effect on the structure of proteins, and changing the structure of those proteins, like enzymes and so on, can change the effectiveness that they function with and ultimately could lead to death. Water is also involved in maintaining acid-base balance for actually the same reason. Water is also involved in maintaining constant electrolyte balance throughout the body. It's involved in the movement of nutrients and waste about the body, to the body, and out of the body. It's involved in lubrication. And most importantly, and one that we often overlook, is it's a constituent of many chemical reactions. So indeed, it's difficult to think of any functions in the in the body that do not involve water. So let's, for a moment, just take a look at the structure of water, because I think it's important that we understand the chemistry of water in order to help us to understand the functions of water and how it influences our pigs and why it's so important. I want to give you an example of why understanding the chemistry of water is so important. And that's a topic called oral rehydration therapy. Before ORT, as we call it, so oral rehydration therapy, was discovered, if people had severe diarrhea, especially young children, you could encourage them to drink lots of water, but that would not be effective. The only real way that was effective was to give them water intravenously. Well, of course, that's not always possible. And so, fortunately, a physician who started to think about water and how water is absorbed by the body thought, you know, if I add to the drinking water of these children with diarrhea, if I add something like glucose and maybe sodium, that will help the body to absorb this water that the children are drinking. And indeed, that's exactly what happened. Because as the glucose and sodium and sometimes potassium moves through the intestinal tract, it will be absorbed by the epithelial tissue. And when it moves across the epithelial tissue, it changes the osmotic pressure across that tissue. And so water is drawn with that sodium and glucose. And when they started this oral rehydration therapy, it had a profound impact on livability of these children. It just made such a difference. And it was because somebody thought about the chemistry of water and the physiology of water and how the body uses water. So as you can see from this diagram, water is made up obviously of hydrogen and oxygen. And you can see that the water molecules are bound by these hydrogen bonds. We can see that water is a polar structure. And because it's a polar structure, that allows water to dissolve many polar and ionic substances. And one of these examples, which is important in the body, of course, is salt. But because water is polar, it does not dissolve non-polar substances very well like fat. So the movement of fat throughout the body and even absorption has to use different mechanisms for that reason. So let's just talk briefly about the chemistry of water and how this chemistry aligns with water's function. Well, first off, water has a high specific heat, which means that water can absorb a large quantity of heat with a very small change in temperature. And this is very, very important for its role in maintaining thermal homeostasis in the pig. So here we can look at this diagram, which shows the specific heat of some common compounds, and here is water. Clearly has the highest specific heat. Alcohol is only about half as much. Soybean oil even is less. We know that things like glass and water and so on, they have a very low specific heat. In other words, if they absorb much heat, then their temperature will rise. Water also has a high heat of vaporization, which means that it requires a large amount of heat in order to convert water from a liquid to a gas. And that's exactly what we do as humans when we're sweating, right? The water is secreted through the sweat glands onto the surface of our body. That water is converted from a liquid to a gas, and that takes energy, takes heat away from our body when that happens. So this is critical for thermal homeostasis. Now, pigs don't sweat very well. They have a few functioning sweat glands, but not very many, most of them around the nose. And so this heat of vaporization, that's why pigs wallow, for example. It's a way for them to get rid of body heat. Water has a high surface tension, which helps in its role in the movement of nutrients and waste. Its maximum electrolyte activities is at 37 degrees, which happens to be close to mammalian body temperatures. So it supports water's essential role as a solvent. And it also has a pH of 7, which is close to physiological pH. And that's consistent with the mammalian need to maintain acid-base homeostasis. So you can see then that the chemistry of water is very well lined up with the roles that it plays in the body of the pig and indeed in our own body. So let's move along now to my second topic is how much water do pigs require? You know, we generally just make water available to the pig and let them figure it out. And that's probably not the wisest thing for us to do. But the question is surprisingly difficult to answer. Before we go any further, let's just take a look at how a growing pig and a lactating sow acquire water and use that water. What's the fate of that water? So here's a 45 kilogram pig, normal growing pig with normal growth rate and feed efficiency. And we can see that of its total intake, about 80% is drinking water. So think about that for a minute. Obviously, drinking water is very, very important, but these other two sources represents 20% of the water that a pig has available to it on a daily basis. 16% of that water comes from metabolism. So normal metabolic processes, as many of you will know, when, for example, when you break down glucose, you will produce CO2 and water. So various chemical reactions going in the body will generate metabolic water, which is important to the pig. Now, where does that water go? Well, about half of it is lost in the urine, and another about a third is lost in respiration. Actually, less than 10% is retained in the body for growth. And as we know, water is associated with lean growth, not so much with the growth of fat, because there's not a lot of water associated with fat, but lean, there's a lot of water in lean, and so growth does require water in order to sustain that. And then, of course, some of the water is lost in the feces. Now let's take a look at a lactating sow. She's nursing, let's say, 12 piglets. She's drinking about 25 liters of water per day. Unfortunately, we don't have really good data on how much water sows actually drink, but we believe that a high producing sow is drinking something in that range of 25 liters. Now, a little bit differently from the growing pig, almost 90% of her water comes from drinking water, and only 9% comes from this metabolic water. However, while it's a smaller proportion than the growing pig, it's a smaller proportion of a much bigger number. And so in the growing pig, metabolic water might represent 700 or 800 mils per day. In this sow, metabolic water will represent between 2 and 2.5 liters of water per day. That's a lot of water. And proportionate to the total, it's small, but I think you would agree that 2 liters of water is important to that nursing sow. Now, when we look at the fate of the water, about 35–40% leaves the body as urine. Also, we lose about 12% through respiration, and about 45% goes out as milk. So that's obviously very, very important, and a small amount goes out as feces. So we're assuming in this number, by the way, that it takes about 4 liters of milk to support the growth of 1 kilogram of gain of the litter. So we actually can calculate with reasonable accuracy how much milk a sow is producing by weighing the growth of her pigs. So challenges in defining water requirement, well, there's quite a few. First off, what performance measure do we use for testing water requirement? If I want to determine the lysine requirement of a pig or the phosphorus requirement of the pig, then I can just do a titration. I can feed different levels of lysine or different levels of phosphorus, and I can measure growth performance. In the case of phosphorus, I might want to measure bone ash or bone breaking strength or something like that, but it's relatively straightforward. But in the pig, it's much, much more complicated than that, because one of the problems is, how do we determine if the pig is deficient? If the pig is getting less water than ideal, that pig can still perform very, very well, because the kidney has the ability to concentrate urine and therefore conserve water. But how do we factor that into our definition of a requirement? Another problem that we have is what we call luxury water intake, that if pigs are hungry, like gestating sows, or if they're bored, like gestating sows, they might drink extra water. We call that polydipsia. And so those pigs apparently are drinking water, and you might think they require that water in total, but they may not, because if they're participating in luxury water intake, then we would greatly exaggerate their water requirement. I've already talked about how the kidney can conserve water, And that's very, very important to the animal, because that's how the animal can maintain water balance and electrolyte balance, but it sure makes it difficult to define water requirements. And then on top of this, there's many factors that influence the water requirement. So for example, and you can look at the list here, and this list is not complete. These are the main items, but there's others involved. But for example, if we increase the level of minerals in the feed, that can increase the pig's requirement for water. If we increase the level of protein in the feed, that can also increase the requirement for water. Although we've done research in that area and it doesn't really increase the water requirement that much. But of course, if there's excess protein in the diet, the pig has to get rid of more urea and more ammonia, and that will increase its water requirements slightly. The level of fiber in the feed will affect the water requirement, and of course the level of feed intake, and we'll come back to that in a minute. The rate of protein accretion, I've kind of explained that, because as the pig is growing its protein mass, it also needs water to support that. There's stressors in the environment, social stressors and so on, that can affect the water requirement of the pig. The health of the pig, you know, there's some diseases that will increase the thirst in the pig, and there's other diseases that will suppress thirst in the pig. So that makes that a particular challenge. And then of course there's the humidity in the environment around the pig and the temperature of the pig, which will influence its water requirement. So all of those factors and some others besides can influence the water requirement of the pig. So let's take a look at some numbers here and some intake by pigs. And here's an example. So these are newborn piglets in the first 4 days after birth. And in a cooler barn, they're drinking a relatively small amount of water. Piglet in this study was drinking only about 25 grams per day. But if they were put in an environment at 28 degrees centigrade, and of course in newborn pigs, we do want them in a warm environment, their water intake can go up to 100, 125 grams or milliliters per pig per day. So that illustrates just one factor, which is environmental temperature, that it can affect the pig's thirst. I like to use these data. This comes from Peter Brook from Great Britain. And Peter was very, very well known in the area of water research when he was still active. So these data are 30 years old now, and we frequently don't look at 30-year-old data because the pig has changed so much. But I think these data are still very relevant. And I also believe that this particular data set illustrates a number of points. So the first thing I would like you to note is that in my title of this slide, I refer to the influence of drinker flow rate on water disappearance and not intake, because intake would be the water that the pig actually receives and enters its stomach, where disappearance is the water flow through the drinker. So this study was in pigs that were 3 to 6 weeks of age. And Peter had 4 different flow rates from 175 to 700 mils per minute. You can see that as the flow rate increased, water disappearance increases pretty much in a linear fashion. So there is no maximum reached here. Feed intake, however, appears to pretty much maximize out at around 450 mils, or somewhere between 450 and 700 mils. Average daily gain increases as the flow rate in the drinker increases until about 450 mils per minute is reached, and then growth rate doesn't increase any further. And the same with feed conversion. Feed conversion appears to be at its best with flow rates between 350 and 450 mils per minute. Now, if we look at the water to feed ratio, because feed intake did increase, but water intake increased more so, the water to feed ratio increases with increasing water flow through the drinker. Interestingly, the greater the flow rate, the faster the pig drinks, or the smaller amount of time that the pig spends drinking. And so one advantage of having a higher flow rate is the pig does not have to spend as much time drinking. And that can be important, and that will influence the number of waterers that we put in a pen, because the flow rate will influence the capacity of that drinker. So if we take a look at these data, and we can see that for the most part, and unfortunately, when I got this table, there was no statistics associated with it, but by looking at the data, it would appear that the optimum is in the range of 450 mils per minute. And so we will assume, because there was increased growth and feed intake at this time and improved feed efficiency, that there's no wasted water here. And that's probably not completely true, but we'll assume that. But we do know then that water that flows through the drinker beyond this is not necessary water, so that would be wasted. So, you know, out of 1.6 liters, 0.3 liters is being wasted. That's pretty substantial. And that's one of the problems. If our nipple drinker flow rates are too high, we waste a lot more water. So frequently, we will define the water requirement as a ratio to feed intake. And so we would respectfully suggest, but there's a lot of variation about these numbers, that in the growing pig, they require about 2.6 liters of water, of drinking water, per kilogram of feed intake. In the finishing pig, it's a little bit lower, it appears from the data, to be about 2.3 liters of water per kilogram of feed intake. Now, that sow data that I was showing you earlier on, in her case, she was consuming about 3.5, 3.6 liters of water per kilogram of feed that she was consuming. Now, of course, that makes a lot of sense, because that sow is producing a lot of milk, and milk is what, about 85% water. So it makes sense that she would have to drink a lot more milk than a growing pig. So, but maybe let's take a minute to look at the water intake in lactating sows. So if we take a look at these data that comes from Dave Fraser, we can see here that he related water intake to the level of activity in the sow. And so he measured the amount of time that the sow spent sitting and standing over the first 72 hours after farrowing. And he found a correlation between that level of activity of about 0.73 with water intake. So the less active sows tended to drink less water, and the more active sows tended to drink more water. That's important, because as we saw, water intake in the sow is very, very important. Well, he went a little bit further in this research, and I like to report on this research because Dave Fraser and his colleague, an engineer named Peter Phillips, just put so much effort into ensuring that they were measuring true intake by the pigs, and they were able to do it on an individual basis. So the sophistication of their equipment was just amazing. But if you take a look here for the period from day 1 to 3, you can see there's a relationship here between sow water intake and the weight gains of these piglets right after farrowing. And that all of the slower growing piglets, say below 100 grams per day average per pig, were all associated with the lower level of water intake by sows. Now, there were other sows that were consuming the same amount of water, and they had piglets that were growing faster. But all of the slow growing pigs were associated with sows that were not drinking a lot of water. Now, for the second week after farrowing, there's still a relationship there, but you can see that it's not as strong a relationship. But even here, the slower growing litters are associated with the sows that drink less than average water, and the sows that drink more than average water, their litters, with maybe one exception, were all growing at a rapid rate. And we would hope to see that these piglets are gaining 220 to 250 grams per day. And so these pigs only gaining 100 to 120 grams a day is clearly lower than what we would expect. But clearly the problem is less acute in the older piglets and in the sows nursing older pigs. But in the first few days after farrowing, this is a critical time in the life of the sow and in the life of the young pig in terms of water. Now, when we look at this relationship, what does this tell us? What do these data tell us? Well, we don't really know, because it's a relationship, and so it doesn't define cause and effect. It just shows a relationship. So it could be that smaller, weak litters in any event demand less milk and thus stimulate little drinking in the sow. That could be one explanation. Or it could be that both low water intake and low milk production are caused by a third factor, such as sow illness, right? That could occur post-farrowing. And there's many explanations for that. But in this experiment, there was none of these that were apparent. And low water intake could just be combined or contributed, to low milk production, just as we saw in previous slides. So bottom line, I think the conclusion from this is that simply placing water in front of the sow just after farrowing does not guarantee that she's going to be drinking adequate water. Now, when we turn our attention to the post-weaning pig, here's a water pattern of intake that we have seen in experiment after experiment. Is just become so repeatable. And what we see in these data is that right after weaning, these pigs seem to have a higher than expected level of water intake, which then declines around to a minimum at day 3 or day 4 after weaning. And then that water intake increases, presumably in relationship with feed intake. But this pattern in the first 3 or 4 days after weaning is very common, and I'll show you some more data in a minute. Now, there's different explanations for why this is occurring. It could be that the pigs are drinking water to achieve satiety, since we know that feed intake in this period is not very good. It could be that in the young pig, like so many other aspects of the physiology of the newly weaned pig, they're not well developed. And so it could be that the regulation of thirst in the young pig is not yet very well developed. And so that pig is over consuming water. But also remember, when the sow or when the piglet is nursing the sow, they get their water and their feed at the same time in the milk. So there's no separation of thirst and hunger. They are combined when they're nursing the mother, and they're satisfied in only one activity, which is nursing. But after weaning, those are become two separate functions, and it may be that the newly weaned pig is not handling those very well. Here's another experiment that we ran, Monique Tremblay's data as a student, graduate student. And again, we see this high initial water intake that declines before it starts to rise in a normal manner. Now, let's take a look at the bottom graph here, which is the scour score. And so these pigs on this treatment had very little diarrhea, and this is the round dots, so we can see the round dots here. But these are the pigs that had a very high scour score, so they had quite substantial diarrhea, and they're identified by squares. So these pigs were drinking a little bit more water than these pigs, but when you see the degree of diarrhea, we would have expected to see greater increase in water. So once again, we have to wonder whether in the newly weaned pig, the physiology of regulating water balance is adequately developed in the pig. So, and I'll show you one more bit of data here. This is, these pigs had very good quality water, very low in mineral content. These pigs had what we would call poor quality water, over 4,000 parts per million of total dissolved solids. So these pigs would have had significant diarrhea, and you can see that in the graph compared to here, although even these pigs had a certain degree of diarrhea post-weaning. And you can see that water intake goes down as the diarrhea score is going up. So there's something going on here that we need to pay attention to. And our conclusion really is that, as I pointed out previously, the newly farrowed sow, and now we can add the newly weaned piglet, are probably two areas where we should pay more attention to water intake, because it doesn't look like things are functioning the way we would like them to. So now I'll move on to my third topic, which is related to water delivery. And water delivery is going to be affected by many factors that we need to pay attention to. The water pressure has to be correct and matched to the water drinker system that we're using. So we need to pay attention to the recommendations of the manufacturer, so the water is delivered at the right pressure and the right amount of flow through the pipes, which of course is influenced by pressure, but we also want to have the right flow through the drinker to the pig. We would like to minimize water waste as much as possible to be good environmental stewards. There's the proper location of the drinker. There's places where you would put a drinker in the pen, and there's places you would not put a drinker in the pen. We need to maintain the drinker, and that's a real challenge, I think, in the barn, because we tend to put the drinkers in place and then don't pay too much attention to them, and that can become problematic. We have to be worried about inadequate water delivery to the pig. I'm going to show a little bit of data in a minute. Then there's the selection of the drinker that is best for a specific situation. That would be related to the age of the pig, the cost of water, etc., because the cost of water will influence our tolerance for wastage of water. And then there's been much more interest in the last 5 to 10 years on biofilm in water delivery systems, and we have to pay very close attention to that, and probably should be disinfecting our water delivery system much more frequently than we see on most commercial farms in this country. So is there a best system for delivering water to pigs? Well, I don't think there is a best system. There are systems that are better for some circumstances than others, but it also will be impacted by the producer's preference. These are swinging drinkers, and I'll show you some data on these, which are different from the same kind of drinker, but that are affixed to the pen partitions. So the swinging drinker will waste less water than will this, and it gives the pig something to play with. Although they certainly, if you watch pig behavior, they will play with regular nipple drinkers as well. There's wet dry feeders, which probably waste the least amount of water. And then there's dish drinkers, which also will waste a small amount of water, but of course they need to be maintained because they can become fouled if they're not properly positioned. And then there's these waters that we can put in the pen for newborn piglets or newly weaned piglets if we want to provide water supplementation. So when I answer the question about is there a best system to deliver water, there's some are better than others, but perhaps no best system overall. But we can certainly say that this isn't one. And this shows how a drinking water line and a drinker can become fouled. And obviously this is not going to deliver very much water to the pig. And that's why our water delivery system must be maintained. And in my experience, maintained a lot more than they typically are. Now, if we look at this, these data, what these data are showing is this is the water delivery of 20 pens related to the amount of water being delivered to pen number 1. And pen number 1 is the pen that is closest to the water source. And we can see that as we get further and further away from the water source, the amount of water that's being delivered to the pigs declines. And you can see in this case, it declines by about 65%. That is a big, big drop. And so these pigs might be getting plenty of water, but these pigs might not. So the design of our delivery system is really important. We have to put in large enough water lines under the enough pressure to ensure that pen 20 is delivering every bit as much water as pen number 1. Because if we don't, these pigs clearly are going to suffer from lack of water intake, and that will then affect their growth rate. Now, continuing, we see data from a different barn, and what we see is the same kind of drop, not as much as in the previous example, but where the red arrow is right here, there was renovation in the barn, and so they had to make an adjustment in the water delivery line to be able to accommodate something that was getting in the way of the water line. So they had to put in some 90-degree, they put in 4 90-degree elbows into the water line to allow the water line to come out from the wall, go around the obstruction, and then go back to the wall and continue on its way. But when you put 4 90-degree elbows into a water line, you're going to reduce the water delivery rate. And so we have to be very careful when we're renovating a barn. We can have a barn that's designed really, really well when we build it, but a simple mistake like this can really impact on the delivery of water to pigs in these more distant pens. So the recommended flow rates, some of the data that I see recommend really, really high flow rates, and there's just no data to support those. And people believe that if you have a higher flow rate, then you will, one, maybe increase water consumption. And of course, if you are comparing that to too low a flow rate, you will. But once you reach a certain level of flow, increasing the flow rate beyond that is just not going to be helpful. I saw some data just very recently where lactating sows were getting water and the nipple drinker flow rate was over 5 liters per minute. That's just crazy, right? And so it would be wasting a huge amount of water. And I dare say the sow may not actually like drinking from such a water because the flow is just way too high for her. But we think 1 to 2 liters per minute is good for lactating sow, 1 to 1.5 liters a minute for boars in our boar studs. Nursing piglets, I showed you some data from Peter Brooks earlier on, and there's data that's more recent than that, and it all points for nursing piglets and for weanling pigs that, half to 0.7 liters per minute for nursing pigs and 0.7 to 1 for weanling pigs seems to be very adequate. These numbers, 0.7 to 1 liters per minute for growing pigs and finishing pigs, would appear to be fine, but these flow rates are currently being under review to see if they are correct. So let's take a look at some measurements in a barn that it was a research barn, but a very commercial-like research barn. Growing pigs at a little over 50 kilos and finishing pigs a little over 70 kilos. You can see good appetite. Water disappearance was 5.3 liters per day. Feed intake was 1.7. Actual water intake, water disappearance was 5.3 liters, but actual water intake by the pigs was only 4 liters per day. And the water intake to feed ratio was 2.4, which is fairly close to what we identified before at 2.6. So there's a lot of water being wasted, 1.3 liters out of a total of 5.3 liters. And in the finishing pig, we see the same thing. The water to feed ratio goes down in the finishing pig as we expected. The water flow, the water disappearance is very high, much higher than the actual water intake. So almost 2 liters of water is being wasted per pig per day in this particular barn, operated in this fashion. Okay, so now we will turn to our final topic, which is, excuse me, I have one more slide here to talk about wastage and water drinkers. And this is also data from Mike Brum. Did a lot of work in this area and deserves a lot of credit. He really led our industry in developing this information. And he showed with a wet dry feeder, the water disappearance was 4.5 liters per pig per day. Compared to a dry feeder with separate nipple drinkers, it was over 6 liters per pig. Comparing those swinging nipple drinkers with wall mounted, it's 4.9 versus 5.5. So the swinging drinker reduces wastage. Bowl, of course, wastes less water than even the swinging nipple drinker, 3.8 versus 5.0. So the selection of drinker system can certainly influence the wastage of water. Okay, now let's turn to water quality to wrap up my talk. And we can measure many of these factors that I've listed here, but the ones that I have in blue are the ones that I think are the ones that we are most interested in. Obviously, we don't want to be constantly delivering pathogens to the pigs, to our pigs in the water. So evaluating the microbiological content of our water is very, very important. Total dissolved solids is a measure of all of the minerals that are in the water and gives us an overview of what might be going on. What we're particularly interested in is sulphate because of the diarrhea that it causes. Iron and manganese are important. They will change the taste of the water, and I don't know of any taste tests that have been done to evaluate this, but it certainly can wreak havoc in our water delivery system because this iron and manganese will precipitate out, and can block nipple drinkers. It can cause problems in our hot water heaters and so on. So just showing some data from, this was an on-farm study, a 1200 sow fair to finish barn with some pretty low quality water, very high sulfate levels, very, very high iron levels. And they had a reverse osmosis unit on site. So we compared these two water systems to see how the pigs performed. We looked at newly weaned pigs from day 0 of weaning to 35 days later. We also compared nipple and dish drinkers. And you can see, so the pigs were weaned at less than 6 kilograms. They finished the trial at around 21. There was no difference at all in average daily gain due to the water, whether it was the untreated water from the well or the water treated with reverse osmosis. There was no effect on average daily gain. There was no effect on average daily feed intake. And in terms of water quality, there was no effect on feed efficiency. I mean, the numbers are identical. There was an effect of drinker type, that the dish drinker gave a better feed efficiency than the nipple drinker. But you can see how much extra water was wasted with the nipple drinker relative to the dish. The ratio of water to feed was 4.4, 4.1 with the nipple drinker, and 2.5 with the dish type drinker. Taking a look at the so basically there was no effect of that very high sulfate on the performance of the pigs. Now, Bridget Lazinski, graduate student, University of Minnesota, just recently reported the results of this experiment where she compared 3 kinds of water. So water C is a fairly good quality water, almost no sulfates at all, very low sulfur, not very hard water. And then B was a little higher in hardness, little higher in sulfates and higher in TDS. And then A would be what we would call the worst quality water of over 1,100 parts per million of sulfate, which is quite high. And again, if we look at the performance of these pigs, water A, water B, and water C, no effect on average daily gain, no effect on feed intake, and no effect on feed efficiency. So once again showing, and this has just been shown over and over and over again. Now the pigs that are on the high sulfate water, those pigs here will have probably severe diarrhea. Certainly in the experiment that I showed on the commercial farm, the 1200 sow farm, there was a lot of diarrhea. And the workers in the barn were convinced that the pigs on the high sulfate water were underperforming the other pigs. They just look bad. They perform equally, but they sure don't look as nice. And people interpret, you know, if I see a pig with diarrhea, that pig's not performing well. And when it comes to the osmotic type of diarrhea, as opposed to a pathogen-induced diarrhea, the osmotic diarrhea does not seem to affect the performance of the pigs. So finishing off then with the take-home messages that just to summarize what I've said, water is essential for life. It plays critical roles in all aspects of the nutrition, physiology, and biochemistry of the pig, and that the chemistry of water is ideally suited to these roles. Defining the pig's requirement for water is very difficult to do because it's influenced by the environment, by diet composition, by feed intake, by the health of the pig, by behavior, so many factors. So definitively saying this is the requirement of water of these pigs in this situation is difficult to do. There is no best way to deliver water to a pig. It depends on each individual circumstance, but in all cases, water must be readily and consistently available throughout the whole barn and all locations in the barn, while at the same time hopefully minimizing waste. There's areas where water intake may be a problem in our barns, and one of those is the sow at farrowing and the other is the pig right after weaning. Low milk production in sows is associated with low water intake. We're not sure if this is a cause or an effect, but active sows do drink more water than inactive sows. And pigs are more tolerant than expected to high mineral levels in their drinking water. It may be associated with profuse diarrhea, but that is not a sign of poor growth performance. And as I said, we've seen that in many experiments. And but the one question that we don't know about water quality, and nobody has run this experiment yet that I'm aware of, and that is that if we're feeding this high sulfate water, which results in an osmotic diarrhea, does that then predispose the pig to a pathogen challenge if it's exposed to enterotoxigenic E. coli or salmonella or some other pathogen that attacks the intestinal tract? That's one question that we just don't have an answer to. So with that, Mathieu, I will finish my presentation. I want to say thank you very much to everybody who spent some time with us today, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, John, for this very informative presentation and a lot of practical advices. So I would like to remind to the attendees that you have the possibility to ask questions. Please use the chat function, write down your questions, and we will take them. So John, I was very pleased to hear that you were talking about the oral rehydration therapy, ORT, which is something that Tonisity is dealing with every day. And also I was very pleased to hear that you mentioned the importance of water in the baby pig, the importance of water post-weaning, because we have seen that by supporting, not only providing water, but supporting the guts through ORT, it's possible to reduce pre-weaning mortality. It's possible to reduce the mortality in post-weaning. It's possible to reduce the number of fall behinds in post-weaning. So we strongly believe that there is something to do there. I have a question for you, John. In your experience, what would be the most common mistakes that are made in water management for the pig?
Thank you, Mathieu. And maybe just to add on to your comments about the newly weaned pig, I think the one thing we need to keep in mind is that intestinal tissue turns over very, very quickly. And even in the case of humans, if we are not eating for any length of time, that means that nutrients are not getting to our intestinal tissues. That tissue breaks down very, very quickly. In other words, it has to have almost constant supply of food in order to continue to regenerate itself. So when you have a newly weaned pig or a newborn piglet, if they are not getting nutrients into the intestinal tract, that can adversely affect the intestinal tissue, and of course that does not bode well for the future of that young pig. So I certainly I agree with that philosophy, Mathieu. Now, with respect to the most common problem, I would I would think the one that I think impacts pigs the most is the lack of maintenance of the water delivery system. I think we should more frequently check water flow rates throughout our barn to make sure that we are still delivering the water to the pigs that we may have been in when the barn was brand new, but are we still doing that now? That would be number one. Number two, I think we have to pay attention to the cleanliness of the water delivery system. I mentioned biofilms, and we're paying a lot more attention to that. So for example, if you're trying to deliver medication through the water to pigs to treat them for an illness, some of that medication is going to adhere to the biofilm in the water line, which means that some of that medication is not going to get to the pigs at the rate that we thought we had designed it to. But also when we take the medication away, there's going to be some small amount of medication still being delivered to those pigs as it gets released by the biofilm. And that's just an ideal circumstance for enhancing or exacerbating the problem of antibiotic resistance. So we have to be really careful about cleaning our water delivery system on a regular basis. And I think it should be done shot chlorination twice a year or constant chlorination, whichever people prefer. And then the other one is, and this doesn't get done very frequently, it's one of those things that I think we view that theoretically it's important, but getting it done in the barn is difficult, and that is adjusting the height of the drinkers. For example, we would like, if we're using nipple drinkers that are at a 45-degree angle, we would like that drinker to be above the shoulder height of the pig. Well, if we put it too high when we are loading the barn, then that means the small piglets can't reach the water. But if we make it too low, then as the pigs grow, then the drinker is too low, and if we don't adjust it, then we're going to waste more water. So there's a number of components to it, but maintenance of the water delivery system, Mathieu, I think is one of our biggest issues.
Okay, thank you. So a few questions are coming. The first one is actually not a question, but more of a comment. Very surprised to see no correlation between the cows and the growth performance.
Yes. Yeah, and I can tell you, whoever has asked this question, that this is, you are not the first person to be very surprised, okay? And that's why I tried to emphasize that there's a very big difference between an osmotic diarrhea and a diarrhea caused by a pathogen. Because in the case of osmotic diarrhea, what is happening is, what we believe to be happening, is that the water gets either absorbed by the pig and then is removed from the blood by the kidney and resecreted, is resecreted into the intestinal tract. It can be secreted through the urine as well, or it just passes through the intestinal tract and doesn't get absorbed at all. But in any event, this makes this high osmotic pressure here, which will draw water into the intestinal tract, and that's what creates the diarrhea. So this is more of a physical cause to the diarrhea, and it makes the pigs look bad because they're going to be dirty, of course, and then we see this and we think the pigs are not performing well. Now, if we have a diarrhea that's caused by pathogens, that's very, very different, because that's a diarrhea that's caused by physiology, and that's going to change the functioning of the gut. That's going to change the structure of the gut. And so that's a very different circumstance. And then, of course, there is a correlation between performance and diarrhea that's caused by a pathogen. So you're not surprised. When I first started the research, I was also I'm very surprised, or you were surprised, and I was surprised, but we ran experiment after experiment after experiment, and Bridget Lazinski's most recent study, we get the same answer over and over and over again.
Okay, thank you. There are few people who are asking the same question, and we had also in the morning session, we had that very same question. So it seems like it's a hot topic for today. The question is about the water temperature. What is the best temperature for the piglets, for the sows, and also can temperature of the water affect the performance of the pigs? Is there an ideal performance, ideal temperature range?
Yes, very, very good questions. And as we talked at the earlier session, the data are not definitive. There are some data which would show, and probably the best data, the most consistent, that if animals are in a hot environment, then colder water will help them to deal with that heat stress. And when you think about it and how water is delivered to the pig, as the water, the water comes out of the well or the delivery system, it will be cold, it will be chilled. But as it enters into the water delivery system and flows through the barn, it will start to heat up. And especially if it's very hot weather, then that water is going to heat up even more. But the other side of the coin is in hot weather, the pigs are going to be drinking more water, and that's going to draw more water through the system and help to keep the water cooler because it doesn't get to sit in the water lines very long to warm up. So we would like to see water that is cool for pigs that are heat stressed. But if the pigs are not heat stressed, water temperature I have not seen any data that would convince me that water temperature is going to affect the performance of the pigs. But if they're heat stressed, then there's data showing both ways, but it would appear on balance that cooler water does improve performance with heat stressed pigs. And it makes sense.
Thank you, John. I have a question about medication which are distributed through water and disinfection of the water. So what do you recommend? Should we stop the medication when we clean the line, or when we
Yes.
give the medication, do we have to stop? What do you recommend?
Great. Really, really good question, and a question that we're learning more and more about. There's a researcher in Australia, Dr. Little, Stephen Little, who's doing some really, really good work on this. And the more we learn, the more we realize we've got to understand this much better in the future than we do in the past. And at least in our world, I don't know where you're asking this question from, but here in North America, with the new regulations, we are delivering medications much more frequently in the water than we are in the feed. So we can focus the delivery of medications. We can reduce the amount of medications that we're actually using. We deliver it as soon as we see illness, and we deliver the proper dose for the proper length of time, and then we can stop, which is very difficult to do in feed, of course. However, water consumption in pigs is highly variable. The medicators themselves don't always portion out the additives as accurately as we would like, although that technology is getting better. There's better products on the market. But getting into your question about cleaning the line, it's the best time to do the cleaning is before you medicate, is to keep the line clean all the time. Because trying to clean that line after you've delivered the medication, well, generally if we're going to shock chlorinate, for example, if we've just had some pigs that were sick and we've given the medication and they've recovered, and then we disturb water delivery because we're shock chlorinating the water line, that would not be a good thing. I think we should be shock chlorinating the water. Ideally, most of our barns, certainly from wean to finish, this doesn't apply to sows, but in wean to finish, they're operated on an all-in, all-out basis. So we would recommend shock chlorinating the water line as part of the cleanup process when the barn's being cleaned out, at least once a year. My preference would be twice a year. We would use chlorine, and there's lots of descriptions in the internet on how to shock chlorinate, and where to get chlorine, and there's a number of different chlorine products even that can be used, and there's other products that can be used besides chlorine to help to break down this biofilm. But this biofilm is really tenacious. It's once it gets established, it's very difficult to clean up water lines, and so we have to. It's, you know, this would be another example of prevention is way better than trying to cure. So that's why we recommend disinfection on a regular basis, and so we don't have to worry about the accumulation of the biofilm. Now, with respect to your specific question and cleaning the water line, after we stop the medication, then we just stop the medication and we're just back to regular water. We just disconnect the medicator, and that's how we're treating pigs now. So a lot of medications, you're only providing it for a relatively short period of time, just a matter of a few days.
Okay, thank you, John. That question was actually from Portugal.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so I think we're about to close the webinar. Just one last question for you, because you've been dealing with water for quite a few years and you've been very interested by that subject, so interested that you are in the process of writing a book about water, so you know what you're talking about. Have you seen a change in the requirement for water in pigs over the, let's say, the last 20 or 30 years?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question, Mathieu. And the answer to that question is that if we break down requirement to its fundamental components, then I don't think there has been much change. Now, of course, our sows need to drink much more water now because they're nursing many, many more pigs than they did 2 decades ago. You know, instead of weaning 8 to 10 pigs a litter, they're now weaning 11, 12, 13 pigs per litter. And so, of course, they need to drink more water. But if we look at that and break it down, the amount of water required per piglet, then we really don't see much change. Just as a, you know, the analogy could be if we're looking at the lysine requirement of a growing pig, and we would say, well, of course the pig needs more lysine now than it did 2 decades ago because pigs grow much faster now than they did, and we've also changed the appetite of the pig. But if we express the lysine requirement per unit of protein gain, then there's very little difference over the last 20 years. So in other words, we haven't changed the pig so that it uses lysine more or less efficiently. There may have been some changes in the lysine requirement for maintenance, but that's a relatively small portion of the total lysine requirement. So you could say, yes, the lysine requirement has changed because the pig is growing faster and accreting more protein. But if you express it per unit of protein gain, the requirement hasn't changed. And we would say the same about water. We're doing a better job of delivering water to the pigs, and that is certainly helping pigs to perform better. And a high-producing sow needs a lot more water than a sow of 20 years ago. Again, you go back to that thumb rule that a sow is producing about 4 liters of milk per kilogram of litter gain. And so if you've got a litter that's gaining about 250 grams per day on an individual pig basis, you multiply that by the number of pigs that are in the litter, and you multiply that by 4, and that will tell you how much milk that sow is producing. And that will give you a good sense of how much water that sow needs to drink.
Okay, thank you very much, John. So thanks everyone for joining the webinar. And thanks again, John, for sharing your knowledge with us.
Great.
Goodbye.
Well, thank you very much, Mathieu.